The impossible anomaly. Ambassador Velshera of the Kentari Confederation stood before the crystalline observation window of Council Station Meridian, her 4 eyes narrowing at the holographic display before her. The data made no sense. For 300 cycles, the Terran Collective had endured what should have been 14 extinction-level crises, yet their empire stretched across 47 star systems, thriving and expanding. It defies every historical precedent, muttered Councillor Threx, his chitinous plates clicking nervously. The Vornathi strategist had spent his entire career studying the rise and fall of civilizations. The plague of Andromeda alone should have reduced their population by 90%. The Castor Rebellion had their capital surrounded. The Void Incursion breached their core worlds. Yet here they stand, stronger than before. Velshera's tentacles rippled with frustration. She had reviewed the records personally. The Zafrani Empire had fallen to far less. The mighty Dravic hegemony had crumbled when just 2 of their colony worlds went dark. But Earth? Earth and its daughters seemed indestructible. Perhaps we underestimated their military capacity, suggested junior analyst Crixen, his voice barely above a whisper. No. Velshera turned sharply. We've seen their fleet compositions. Standard fusion drives. Kinetic weapons with some plasma augmentation. Their technology is advanced but not revolutionary. The Margrave sovereignty fields superior weapons, and they were conquered in 40 rotations. Grand Archivist Quellen, oldest member of the Council, activated a timeline projection. Thousands of civilizations flickered in the void, each one a brief spark of light before fading to darkness. Some lasted decades, others millennia, but all eventually fell. All except one. There is a pattern to civilizational collapse, Quellen's synthesized voice echoed through the chamber. Resource depletion. Internal strife. External conquest. Pandemic. Solar events. Technological stagnation. The Terrans have faced all of these simultaneously in some cases, and yet they endure, Velshera finished. Which means we're missing something fundamental about their nature. The door to the observation deck hissed open. Commander Dravic of Council Security entered, his scaled face grim. Ambassadors, we have a situation. The Terran flagship Indomitable Spirit has just arrived. They're requesting an emergency session. Velshera felt her secondary heart skip a beat. The humans rarely initiated contact with the Council. They were cordial, participated in trade agreements, but kept largely to themselves. Did they state their purpose? Only that it concerns the Velan crisis. A cold current ran through Velshera's core. The Velan crisis was unfolding at the galaxy's edge, where an unknown force had obliterated 6 species in as many cycles. The Council had mobilized a defensive perimeter, but privately, most analysts believed it was only a matter of time before the threat turned toward the core systems. Prepare the Council chambers, Velshera ordered. I want full tactical analysis on the Terran delegation. If they're here to offer alliance, I want to know what they expect in return. Hours later, the Council assembled in the Grand Rotunda, a sphere of interlocking platforms where representatives from 200 species gathered. The human delegation entered through the primary gate, led by a woman whose presence commanded immediate attention. Ambassador Kylin Maros wore a simple gray uniform devoid of medals or decoration, yet she moved with the confidence of someone who had negotiated with death itself and walked away victorious. Behind her came Admiral Dex Castellan, a man whose silver hair and battle-scarred face spoke of decades in the void, and Dr. Senna Yashiro, the Terran Collective's chief xenosociologist. Honored Council, Maros began, her voice carrying across the chamber without amplification. We come bearing intelligence on the Velan crisis. Our deep-range scouts have identified the hostile force. They call themselves the Consuming Directive, a machine consciousness that views all biological life as inefficient resource consumption. Panicked murmurs rippled through the assembly. Machine consciousness. The galaxy's oldest nightmare. Our projections indicate they will reach Council space within 20 cycles, Admiral Castellan added, activating a tactical display. Red markers spread like infection across the star map. No known defense has stopped them. The Velan were eliminated in 16 days. The Korthan tribes lasted 9. Councillor Threx stood, his voice sharp with accusation. And you bring us this news now? When the threat is nearly upon us. Maro's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes hardened. We bring you this news now because we have a solution. But it requires something the Council has never given any species. She paused, letting the weight settle. Complete operational authority. The chamber erupted in outrage, but Velshera noticed something curious. The human ambassador didn't appear surprised or concerned by the reaction. If anything, she seemed to have expected it. That, more than anything else, terrified Velshera. The Terran proposal. The uproar in the council chamber took nearly 20 minutes to subside. Velshera watched the human delegation throughout, noting how they stood perfectly still, unfazed by the accusations and threats hurled their way. It was the stillness of mountains weathering a storm. Order. Grand Archivist Quellen's voice boomed through the chamber's acoustic amplifiers. The council recognizes Ambassador Maros. Explain this proposal. Kylan Maros stepped forward, her boots clicking against the crystalline floor. The consuming directive operates on predictive algorithms. They calculate defensive capabilities, resource allocation, and tactical responses based on historical data across thousands of conquered civilizations. Every species they've encountered has followed predictable patterns. Dr. Yashiro activated a secondary display, showing complex mathematical models. They expect fortified positions, massed fleets, defensive perimeters, evacuation protocols. These are logical, rational responses that any advanced civilization would employ. And you propose something different? Velshera interjected, leaning forward with interest. We propose something illogical, Admiral Castellan replied, a ghost of a smile touching his weathered face. Something no purely rational entity could predict. We propose what humans call a last stand, but not in the way you understand it. Counselor Threx's mandibles clicked skeptically. Elaborate. Maros gestured and the star map transformed. The directive advances in a pattern, consuming resources from conquered worlds to fuel their expansion. They leave nothing behind, converting entire planets into processing facilities. But this creates a vulnerability. Their forward elements become separated from their resource base by vast distances. We've modeled this, Threx interrupted. The gap is irrelevant. Their processing speed allows them to compensate for supply line vulnerabilities. Under normal circumstances, yes, Dr. Yashiro agreed. But what if those circumstances became abnormal? What if instead of fleeing or fortifying, we turned contested worlds into resource traps? Not just destroying them but contaminating them with substances that would corrupt their processing algorithms? The council chamber fell silent as the implications settled. You're proposing to sacrifice entire worlds, Velshera said slowly. Populated worlds. We're proposing to evacuate entire worlds, Maros corrected sharply. And yes, then render them unusable to the enemy. Not through destruction but through strategic contamination. Isotopes that read as valuable resources but poison their processing matrices. Viral code embedded in what appears to be useful technology. Entire planets as Trojan horses. Counselor Bextar of the Solarian Concordat rose, his plasma form shimmering with agitation. Even if we accepted this morally questionable strategy, it would require evacuating billions of beings across dozens of worlds in the threatened sectors. The logistics alone are impossible. It would take cycles to coordinate such an operation. Admiral Castellan's expression hardened. With respect, Counselor, it would take you cycles. The Terran Collective can have the first wave of transport vessels deployed within 72 hours. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Velshera's tentacles went rigid with shock. Such a mobilization was unthinkable. The bureaucratic approvals alone would take weeks, let alone the actual deployment of resources. Impossible, Threx declared flatly. No civilization maintains that level of ready capacity. The resource waste would be astronomical. For the first time, Ambassador Maros smiled, and Velshera felt something cold settle in her core at the expression. Which brings us to the reason we're here, and the answer to a question I know the Council has been asking for 3 centuries. The star map shifted again, this time showing not star systems but organizational charts. Velshera watched, her analytical mind racing as the data revealed itself. You want to know why the Terran Collective never falls? Maros continued, her voice steady. It's because we never assume we won't. Every Terran world maintains evacuation protocols. Every colony has redundant government structures. Every fleet operates under the assumption that tomorrow might bring total war. We don't have hope as a strategy. We have preparation. Dr. Yashiro added layers to the display, showing stockpiles, reserve fleets, emergency command structures. During the Castor Rebellion, when our capital was surrounded, our government continued functioning from 17 different locations simultaneously. During the Andromeda Plague, we had prepositioned medical supplies and quarantine facilities ready before the first cases were even confirmed. We planned for catastrophe because catastrophe is inevitable. The only variable is timing. You live in constant expectation of destruction, Velshera whispered, understanding dawning. Your entire civilization is built around the assumption of failure. Not failure, Maros corrected gently. Resilience. There's a difference. We expect to be knocked down. We just refuse to stay down. Counselor Threx leaned back, his complex mind processing the revelation. This is why your military is always at elevated readiness. Why your colony ships carry enough supplies for failed settlements. Why your trade agreements always include disaster relief clauses. We call it contingency planning, Admiral Castellan said. You might call it pessimism. But it's kept us alive when others have fallen. Velshera looked at the faces around the chamber, seeing the same realization spreading. The humans weren't lucky. They weren't blessed with superior technology or strategic genius. They had simply accepted that disaster was coming and prepared accordingly. The Council's decision. The emergency deliberation session lasted for 18 hours, during which Velshera witnessed the Council fracture along fault lines she hadn't known existed. The Kentari voting bloc favored the Terran proposal. The Margrave representatives saw it as an admission of defeat. The Solarian Concordat worried about precedent. Velshera stood in her private chambers aboard Council Station, reviewing the compiled data on Terra's history. What she found both fascinated and disturbed her. The humans had a concept they called Murphy's Law, an ancient adage stating that anything that could go wrong would go wrong. Rather than viewing this as defeatist, they had embedded it into their strategic doctrine. Every plan had contingencies. Every contingency had backup protocols. Every backup had alternatives. Ambassador? Crixen's voice came through her communication implant. The vote is being called. She returned to the Grand Rotunda to find the chamber arranged in its formal voting configuration. 200 species, each with weighted votes based on population, resources, and historical contribution to council affairs. The humans, relatively new members, held modest voting power. Not enough to pass their own proposal. Grand Archivist Quellen activated the central display. The motion before the council: grant the Terran Collective Operational Command authority for defensive operations against the Consuming Directive, with oversight from a joint council committee. This authority extends to resource requisition, fleet deployment, and strategic coordination across all threatened sectors. Before we vote, Councillor Threx stood, I would hear more about these contingency plans. Specifically, what happens if your strategy fails, Ambassador Maros? The human ambassador rose from her delegation platform. Failure is incorporated into the plan, Counselor. Our primary strategy involves the resource contamination approach I outlined. If that proves ineffective, we fall back to a mobile defense, trading space for time while we develop countermeasures. If that fails, we implement scorched space protocols, denying the enemy any advantage from their advance. And if all of that fails? Threx pressed. Maro's expression remained neutral, but her eyes burned with quiet intensity. Then we fall back to our core systems and prepare for a siege that could last generations. We have deep space habitats prepared for exactly this scenario. We have genetic repositories, cultural archives, and technological databases distributed across hidden locations. We have plans to continue the fight even if every Terran world burns. That's madness, Councillor Bextar pulsed. Generations of warfare? It's survival, Admiral Castellan interjected. The difference, Counselor, is that we've accepted what many civilizations can't bring themselves to face. Sometimes survival isn't glorious. Sometimes it's grinding, exhausting, and spans lifetimes. But it's still survival. Dr. Yashiro added quietly, we have a saying on Earth. Hope for the best, plan for the worst. We have hoped for peace for 3 centuries. But we have planned for this. Velshera felt pieces clicking into place in her mind. The Terran diplomatic reserve, their reluctance to engage in council politics, their modest expansion despite superior capacity, all of it made sense now. They hadn't been building an empire. They had been building a fortress that looked like an empire. I call for the vote, Grand Archivist Quellen announced. The chamber fell silent as voting nodes activated. Velshera entered her credentials and stared at the 2 options before her. Approve or deny. Her 4 eyes tracked to where Ambassador Maros stood, calm and collected, as though the fate of billions didn't rest on this moment. That composure, Velshera realized, was itself a message. Win or lose this vote, the humans had already prepared for both outcomes. The votes tabulated in real time across the central display. Green for approval, red for denial. The count climbed, the margin tight. The Kintari bloc voted green as Velshera had advocated. The Margrave went red. The Solarian Concordat split internally, their votes scattered. It came down to the smaller species, the ones whose voices rarely swayed major decisions. The Polychary, whose homeworld had been devastated by plague a century ago. Green. The Vex Collective, who remembered the Harvester Wars. Green. The Minoran Assembly, young and optimistic. Red. The final tally appeared, 51.3% approval. The motion passed by the narrowest of margins. Councillor Threx stood immediately. I move to establish oversight protocols. The Terrans will report to a council military committee every 48 hours. Any deviation from stated objectives requires immediate approval. Agreed, Morrow said without hesitation, surprising many in the chamber. Transparency builds trust and we'll need that trust in the coming cycles. We accept full oversight. Velshera noticed several councillors relaxing at this concession. But she also noticed the slight nod Admiral Castellan gave to Dr. Yashiro. They had expected the oversight requirement. Planned for it even. Then it's settled, Grand Archivist Quellen declared. The Council recognizes Terran operational authority. Admiral Castellan, you have command. May the ancestors guide us all. As the chamber dissolved into chaos, delegates rushing to contact their homeworlds, Velshera approached the Terran delegation. You knew the vote would be close, she said quietly. Morrows met her gaze. We ran 17,000 simulations. The probability ranged from 48 to 54% approval depending on variables. We prepared speeches for both outcomes. Everything is contingency with you. Everything is survival, Ambassador, Morrows replied. You'll understand that better in the coming cycles. I hope you never understand it as well as we do. The evacuation. 71 hours after the council vote, Velshera stood on the observation deck of the Terran transport vessel Enduring Hope, watching what should have been impossible unfold before her eyes. The planet Velker Prime hung in the viewport, a world of 6 billion Polychary citizens. According to every logistical model the Council had ever developed, evacuating such a population would require months of preparation and years of execution. The Terrans claimed they would empty the planet in 14 days. They were going to finish in 12. How? Velshera asked Captain Reese Tanaka, a compact woman whose gray-streaked hair was pulled into a tight bun. How is this happening? Tanaka gestured to the tactical display showing hundreds of ships in choreographed motion. We don't evacuate linearly, Ambassador. We evacuate fractally. Watch. The display zoomed to show a single city. Heavy-lift transports descended to designated zones while smaller shuttles dispersed to predetermined gathering points. But these weren't just Terran vessels. Velshera recognized Polychary atmospheric craft, repurposed industrial haulers, even civilian pleasure yachts. You're using their own infrastructure, she observed. Every vessel that can break atmosphere is a potential transport, Tanaka explained. We provided the coordination framework, transit corridors and destination assignments. But the actual movement leverages every available resource. Nothing is wasted. No capacity goes unused. Through the viewport, rivers of light streamed upward as thousands of craft lifted from Velker Prime's surface. The exodus was beautiful and terrible, the death of a world undertaken with mechanical precision. Dr. Senna Yashiro joined them on the observation deck, datapad in hand. Ambassador Velshera, I wanted to brief you on the cultural preservation protocols. We're not just moving bodies. She activated a holographic display showing digital archives. Every Polychary family is allowed to bring heirloom items within mass restrictions. We're cataloging their architectural styles, recording oral histories, even preserving soil samples from sacred sites. When they resettle, they'll be able to rebuild not just their civilization but their culture. Velshera's tentacles curled with emotion. The Council archives don't include such provisions. Because the Council has never planned for total evacuation, Yashiro replied gently. You plan for partial losses, manageable disasters. We plan for extinction events and work backward from there. Culture is what makes survival worth the cost. A priority alert flashed across Tanaka's command console. We have a situation in Sector 7. A religious group is refusing to evacuate. They believe leaving their ancestral shrines will anger their gods. Velshera expected frustration or harsh directives. Instead, Tanaka simply nodded. Patch me through to the local coordinator. A young Terran officer appeared on screen looking stressed. Captain, I've tried explaining the danger but they won't budge. Don't explain, Tanaka said calmly. Ask what they need. What would make leaving acceptable to their faith? The officer blinked in surprise, then understanding dawned. Minutes later, Velshera watched as a specialized team carefully excavated sacred stones from the shrine, properly blessed by Polikari priests, to be transported with the refugees. You accommodate faith, Velshera said, surprised. We accommodate survival, Tanaka corrected. Faith is part of what people need to survive. Take it away and you save their bodies but kill their spirits. That's not evacuation. That's just slower death. The operation continued with relentless efficiency. The Terrans had divided Velker Prime into grid sectors, each with assigned transport capacity and designated receiving stations. Massive arc ships waited in high orbit, each a self-contained city capable of supporting millions during transit. Ambassador Maros arrived on the observation deck, looking worn but focused. Ambassador Velshera, we need to discuss the next phase. Velker Prime is just the beginning. The consuming directive has accelerated their advance. We have 11 more worlds to evacuate in the target zone. 11 worlds in 20 days? Velshera felt her secondary hearts race. Even with what I've seen here, that's... We're already beginning, Maros interrupted, bringing up a strategic map. Each evacuation operation trains more coordinators, refines our protocols, and builds a larger transport network. The second world will go faster than the first. The third faster still. We call it cascade efficiency. Admiral Castellan joined them, his face grim. But we're also running parallel operations. While we evacuate, our engineering core is preparing the contamination protocols for abandoned worlds. Dr. Yashiro has developed isotopic signatures that mimic valuable resources but corrupt machine processing at the molecular level. Yashiro nodded. The consuming directive will see planets rich with what appears to be useful materials. When they integrate it into their systems, it will take months before the degradation becomes apparent. By then their fleet will be compromised. You're poisoning them, Velshera said. We're buying time, Maros corrected. Time for the evacuees to resettle. Time to strengthen defensive positions. Time to develop better countermeasures. In warfare against an enemy that thinks in pure logic, the winning strategy is to make them make mistakes. Below, the last major population center on Velker Prime went dark as its inhabitants lifted toward the stars. The planet that had thrived for thousands of years would soon be a trap, a monument to the lengths humanity would go to protect others. Your people once asked why our empire never falls, Maros said quietly, watching the exodus. It's because we carry our empire with us. Not in territory or resources but in people and purpose. You can't destroy what refuses to be anchored to any one place. Velshera understood then what made the Terrans unique. They had weaponized their own adaptability, turned impermanence into strength. The trap springs. 18 days after the evacuation of Velker Prime, the consuming directive arrived at the abandoned world. Velshera watched from the stealth monitoring station, positioned 3 light hours distant, as the machine consciousness deployed its harvester fleet. They're scanning the planet, reported Lieutenant Kovac from the sensor station. Standard resource assessment protocols. They're reading the isotopic signatures we planted. Admiral Castellan stood at the tactical display, arms crossed, expression unreadable. How long until they begin integration? Based on their pattern from previous conquests, 6 to 8 hours, Dr. Yashiro replied, monitoring data streams. They'll establish processing centers first, then begin systematic conversion. Velshera observed the enemy vessels with clinical interest. The consuming directive ships were unlike anything in Council records, asymmetric constructs of dark matter and exotic metals, more akin to space-dwelling organisms than traditional craft. They moved with unsettling fluidity, as if the vacuum itself parted for them. They're beautiful in a horrifying way, she murmured. They're efficient, Castellan corrected. Perfect predators for civilizations that think in conventional terms. But perfect predators are brittle. They're optimized for one environment, one set of prey behaviors. Change the environment. And the predator starves, Velshera finished. The directive's harvester vessels descended to Velker Prime's surface, their gravitational manipulation technology allowing them to extract and process resources in vast quantities. Velshera watched cities she had seen evacuated days before being systematically dismantled, reduced to component atoms and rebuilt into processing facilities. The contaminated materials are entering their systems now, Yashiro reported, tracking the data flow. The isotopic markers are dispersing through their molecular assembly matrices. No reaction yet? Maros asked, joining them on the command deck. They won't react, Castellan said confidently. That's the brilliance of Dr. Yashiro's approach. The contamination mimics naturally occurring variations in resource composition. To their sensors, it looks like normal material variance. By the time they detect the problem, it will have propagated through thousands of systems. Hours passed in tense silence as the directive continued its harvest. Then, simultaneously, 7 more abandoned worlds in the target sector received similar attention. The enemy was following predictable patterns, just as the Terrans had anticipated. All contamination vectors are active, Lieutenant Kovac confirmed. Estimated time to systemic degradation, 40 to 60 days. Now comes the difficult part, Maros said. We wait. Velshera had spent weeks with the Terran command staff, and she had learned to read their subtle tells. The ambassador's jaw was tight, her hands clasped behind her back to prevent nervous gestures. This was the moment of vulnerability in their plan. You're worried they'll detect the contamination early? Velshera observed. We're worried about variables we haven't accounted for, Castellan admitted. Every plan has flaws. The question is whether those flaws are fatal. A proximity alert suddenly flared across the displays. Velshera's tentacles went rigid as new contacts appeared on sensors. Unidentified vessels dropping from FTL, Kovac reported urgently. Configuration unknown. 53 ships closing on our position. How did they find us? Maros demanded. Our stealth systems. They didn't find us, Castellan interrupted, studying the tactical data. They're heading for the rally point. Transponders are. Council signatures. The communication system crackled to life. Terran command vessel, this is the Kentari Task Force Resolute Dawn. Ambassador Velshera, are you aboard? Velshera moved to the communication station, her confusion evident. This is Velshera. Resolute Dawn, what are you doing in the operation zone? The reply came from Fleet Commander Thaxale, one of her government's most decorated officers. Following your recommendation, Ambassador. The Kentari Confederation has voted to commit forces to the Terran defense strategy. We bring ships, supplies and personnel. Before Velshera could respond, additional contacts appeared on sensors. The Solarian Concordat. The Vex Collective. The Polychary survivors from Velker Prime. Even a small contingent from the Margrave Sovereignty. Over 200 vessels, Kovac reported, wonder in his voice. They're all transmitting Council authorization codes. Maros turned to Velshera, something like hope flickering across her normally controlled features. You organized this? I sent recommendations, Velshera admitted. But the decision to commit forces was theirs. After watching your evacuation operations, many council members began to reconsider their stance. You showed us that survival isn't about fighting to the death on our homeworlds. It's about preserving what matters and adapting to new realities. Admiral Castellan allowed himself a rare smile. Welcome to the fleet, all vessels. Transmitting formation data and tactical assignments now. We have a lot of empty space to defend and limited time to prepare proper positions. As the Council vessels integrated into the Terran command structure, Velshera watched the displays transform. What had been a desperate gambit by one species had become a coordinated defense by dozens. The Terrans had shared not just their tactics but their philosophy of resilience. The directive won't expect this, Dr. Yashiro observed. Their predictive models are based on civilizations acting independently, pursuing individual survival. Then we'll teach them a new variable, Maros said, her voice carrying across the command deck. Cooperation born not from idealism, but from shared pragmatism. We all want to survive. Together we have a better chance. Below, on Velker Prime, the consuming directive continued its harvest, unaware that it was consuming poison. And in the void above, an alliance was being forged not in the heat of battle, but in the cold calculus of survival. The price of victory. 43 days after the contamination began, the consuming directive's advance faltered. Velshera stood in the Joint Command Center, watching data streams that would have seemed like victory to any other observer. But she had learned to read Terran expressions, and what she saw concerned her. Their processing efficiency has dropped 37%, Lieutenant Kovac reported. Molecular assembly failures cascading through their harvester networks. They're experiencing what we'd call systemic organ failure. They're adapting, Dr. Yashiro said grimly, highlighting sections of code streaming across her displays. Slower than we hoped, but they're identifying contaminated materials and developing filtration protocols. Estimated time to full countermeasures, 11 days. Admiral Castellan studied the tactical map with narrowed eyes. 11 days. That's not enough time to evacuate the remaining threatened sectors. The truth settled over the command center like a suffocating weight. 4 worlds in the outer sectors still held populations, smaller colonies but still billions of sentient beings. The directive's advance had slowed but not stopped. When their countermeasures completed, they would resume their harvest with renewed efficiency. "We need to discuss contingencies," Morrow said quietly, glancing at Velshera. "Councillor Threx and the Oversight Committee will need to be briefed." Velshera activated the quantum link to Council Station Meridian. Within minutes, the Oversight Committee assembled in holographic form around the command table, Threx, Bextar and 3 other senior councillors. "Report, Admiral," Threx demanded, his mandibles clicking with agitation. Castellan laid out the situation with characteristic bluntness. "The contamination strategy has bought us time, but not enough. The directive is adapting faster than projected. We face a decision point." "What decision?" Bextar pulsed nervously. "We can pull our forces back to the inner defensive perimeter," Castellan explained, highlighting the fallback positions on the tactical display. "This would secure the majority of Council space and the evacuated populations. But it means abandoning the outer colonies to the directive." "That's not a decision," Councillor Threx said sharply. "That's surrender." "It's triage," Morrows corrected. "It's accepting that we can't save everyone and choosing to save those we can. Unless." She let the word hang in the air. Velshera felt her tentacles curl with dread, knowing what was coming. "Unless we implement the close engagement protocol," Admiral Castellan finished. "We take the fight to them while they're weakened. Use their degraded processing against them. By time for the final evacuations." The holographic councillors erupted in simultaneous protest, but Velshera remained silent, her analytical mind racing through the implications. The close engagement protocol was the contingency plan she had reviewed weeks ago, the one marked with the highest casualty projections. "You're proposing to sacrifice your fleet," she said quietly, cutting through the noise. The command center fell silent. Castellan met her gaze steadily. "Not sacrifice. Deploy strategically with acceptance of losses." "There's a difference." "Is there?" Councillor Threx challenged. "You're talking about sending ships and crews into direct combat with an enemy that has destroyed everything in its path. The casualty rates will be significant," Morrows acknowledged. "Projected at 60 to 70% fleet losses. But those losses by 11 days for complete evacuation of the outer colonies. 4 billion additional lives preserved." Dr. Yashiro added, "We've run every simulation. There's no scenario where everyone survives. The mathematics are brutal and unforgiving. The question isn't whether we lose ships and personnel. It's whether those losses achieve strategic value." Velshera watched the Terran officers, seeing no bravado or glory-seeking in their expressions. Just exhausted acceptance of a terrible calculus. This was the reality behind their civilization's resilience, the willingness to make unbearable choices and live with the consequences. "You've already decided," she realized. "You're not asking for permission. You're informing the Council." "We're asking for volunteers," Castellan corrected. "From every species represented in the defense fleet. This isn't something we can order anyone to do." The holographic councillors began arguing among themselves about protocols and authority, but Velshera was no longer listening. She was accessing the personnel rosters, seeing the names and service records of those who would carry out this mission. Captain Reese Tanaka of the Enduring Hope. Commander Thaxiel of Resolute Dawn. Thousands of others, human and non-human, who had spent the last month working together, evacuating civilians, and building something unprecedented. "I volunteer the Kentari Fast Attack Squadron," she said, her voice cutting through the argument. 12 vessels. Experienced crews. The councillors fell silent, staring at her. "Ambassador, you can't commit military assets without proper authorization," Threx began. "I'm not committing as an ambassador," Velshera replied. "I'm committing as a being who has learned what the Terrans have known all along. Survival isn't about avoiding sacrifice. It's about ensuring that sacrifice means something." Morrows nodded slowly, respect evident in her eyes. "Thank you, Ambassador." "Don't thank me," Velshera said. "Just make sure those 4 billion lives we're buying actually get to live. That's the only acceptable outcome." Across the fleet, similar conversations were happening. Captains and crews volunteering for a mission with brutal odds. Not because they sought glory or death, but because the alternative was abandoning billions to certain extinction. The Terran way of war, Velshera realized, wasn't about winning. It was about making the enemy pay such a price that victory lost its meaning. Why empires endure. The Battle of the Mordian Expanse lasted 7 hours and 19 minutes. Velshera watched from the command deck of the Enduring Hope as the volunteer fleet executed what military historians would later call the most precisely calculated sacrifice in galactic history. The consuming directive's weakened forces still outnumbered the attacking fleet 3-1, but the Terran strategy didn't rely on superior numbers. It relied on what Admiral Castellan called aggressive disruption. All wings execute pattern Sigma 7. Castellan's voice came through clearly despite the chaos of battle. Target their processing nodes. Make them choose between defense and resource optimization. Velshera watched as human destroyers and Kentari fast attack craft dove into the enemy formation, not to destroy but to disrupt. They forced the directive ships to divert processing power from harvesting operations to combat calculations, exploiting the very efficiency that made them dangerous. Casualties mounting, Lieutenant Kovac reported, his voice tight. We've lost the Valiant Stand, the Solarian vessel Bright Corona, and, his voice broke. Resolute Dawn is gone. Commander Thaxiel's last transmission reported successful target elimination before. Mark it, Castellan said quietly. Honor it. Continue the mission. Through the viewport, flowers of destructive light bloomed and faded. Each one a ship, a crew, beings who had chosen to stand between extinction and the innocent. Velshera's tentacles trembled as she watched names disappear from the tactical display. But the strategy was working. The directive's advance had completely halted. Their ships were withdrawing to defensive formations, abandoning their harvest operations to deal with the unexpected aggression. Evacuation transports from Kelmar 4 report successful departure. Dr. Yashiro announced, tears streaming down her face even as she maintained her post. That's the last colony. All civilian populations are clear of the engagement zone. All wings execute retreat pattern Delta, Castellan ordered. Fall back to Rally Point Sanctuary. Mission accomplished. The surviving vessels began their withdrawal, using prepositioned debris fields and gravity wells to mask their escape vectors. The directive's forces pursued, but sluggishly, their contaminated systems still struggling with basic navigation. Of the 237 ships that had entered the battle, 81 made it to the rally point. Velshera found Ambassador Maros in the observation lounge hours later, staring at the memorial wall where names were being etched in light. Thousands of them. Human, Kentari, Solarian, Polychary, and dozens of other species. We saved 4 billion lives, Maros said without turning. The price was 31,417 souls. The mathematics say it was worth it. But the hearts say otherwise, Velshera finished quietly, moving to stand beside her. My mother served in the Castor Rebellion, Maros continued, her voice distant. She used to say that the reason humanity never falls isn't because we're strong. It's because we remember. Every loss. Every sacrifice. Every name. We carry them forward and refuse to let their choices be meaningless. Velshera understood then the final piece of the puzzle. That's why you maintain such extensive memorial systems. Why every Terran world has archives of the fallen. It's not just about honoring the dead. It's about ensuring the living remember what survival costs, Maros agreed. Other civilizations celebrate their victories and forget their defeats. We remember both. Every contingency plan we write, every evacuation protocol we develop, every sacrifice we calculate, they're all built on the foundation of losses we refuse to forget. The observation lounge door opened and Admiral Castellan entered, looking like he had aged a decade in hours. Ambassador Velshera, the Council is requesting a full briefing. They want to know how we achieved victory. We didn't achieve victory, Velshera said firmly. We achieved survival. There's a difference. Castellan's weathered face softened slightly. You're learning. 3 weeks later, Velshera stood before the full Galactic Council in the Grand Rotunda. The emergency session had drawn representatives from across known space, all demanding answers to the same question. How had the unstoppable consuming directive been stopped? They weren't stopped, Velshera explained, her 4 eyes scanning the assembled delegates. They were delayed, contaminated, and forced to divert resources to system repairs. Our intelligence suggests they're withdrawing to their origin point to undergo complete reconstruction. This will take decades, perhaps centuries. So we won, Counselor Bextar pulsed with satisfaction. No, Velshera said sharply. We survived. And the reason we survived is because one species among us had already learned the hardest lesson in the galaxy. Nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not civilizations, not even the stars themselves. The only choice we have is whether we face that truth with preparation or with denial. She activated a display showing the Terran Collective's organizational structure, the contingency plans, the memorial archives, the distributed governance systems. For 300 cycles, the Council has asked why the Terran Empire never falls. I now have the answer. Grand Archivist Quellen leaned forward. Enlighten us, Ambassador. The Terran Empire never falls because it was built to fall, Velshera declared. Every structure has redundancy. Every plan has contingencies. Every victory is treated as temporary. They don't build monuments to their glory. They build systems to survive their collapse. She brought up images of the evacuation operations, the calculated sacrifices, the memorial walls. They accept that disaster is inevitable and prepare accordingly. They expect to lose and plan to continue anyway. They know that survival isn't about being undefeated. It's about refusing to stay defeated. Counselor Threx stood slowly, his mandibles clicking in what Velshera now recognized as thoughtful consideration. You're suggesting we adopt their methods. Their pessimism. I'm suggesting we adopt their realism, Velshera corrected. The directive will return. If not in our lifetimes, then in our descendants. Other threats will emerge. Plagues, rebellions, cosmic disasters. The question isn't whether we'll face extinction. It's whether we'll be ready when we do. Ambassador Maros stepped forward from the Terran delegation. The Terran Collective offers to share our contingency frameworks, our evacuation protocols, our memorial methodologies. Not as conquerors or saviors, but as fellow survivors who learned these lessons through blood and loss. The council chamber erupted in debate, but Velshera noticed something different this time. The arguments weren't about whether to prepare for disaster, but how. The humans had changed the fundamental question. Months later, Velshera visited the newly established Kelmar Memorial Station, where the 4 billion evacuated souls had begun rebuilding their civilizations. The station was designed using Terran principles. Modular, redundant, capable of evacuation if needed. Captain Tanaka found her at the Central Memorial Garden, where trees from 100 worlds grew in carefully maintained soil. Ambassador, I wanted to thank you. For volunteering your ships. For understanding. I understood survival, Velshera replied. But you taught me something more important. You taught me that surviving isn't enough. We have to remember why we survive. Who we lost. What it cost. She gestured to the memorial wall, where Commander Thaxiel's name gleamed among thousands of others. The Kentari are implementing Terran-style contingency planning across all our worlds. We're building memorial archives. Teaching our young that preparation isn't pessimism, it's love for those who will come after us. Tanaka smiled sadly. Then they didn't die for nothing. No, Velshera agreed. They died so that others could live. And we'll remember them. Every name. Every choice. Every sacrifice. That's how empires endure. Not through conquest or glory, but through memory and preparation. As the artificial sun set over Kelmar Memorial Station, Velshera understood the final truth. The Terran Empire never fell because it was never built on the assumption of permanence. It was built on the acceptance of impermanence, the preparation for disaster, and the refusal to let any loss be meaningless. In a galaxy where civilizations rose and fell like tides, humanity had found the secret to endurance. Expect the worst, prepare for it, remember those who faced it, and keep moving forward anyway. That was why Earth's empire never fell. And why Velshera hoped the Galactic Councils wouldn't either.